Welcome to the Rough Terrain Forklift Safety course about operation. Improperly prepared and operated rough terrain forklifts are susceptible to collisions, tipping, and losing their loads. In addition to important hands-on training, there are some general best practices of which you should be aware to avoid these incidents. By the end of the course, you will know how and when to start rough terrain forklifts. Recall safe practices to avoid collisions when operating rough terrain forklifts. Recall safe practices to prevent tip-overs when operating rough terrain forklifts. Recall safe practices for performing lifts with rough terrain forklifts, and know how to safely park rough terrain forklifts. Make sure to fasten your seatbelt before you begin moving. Before starting the rough terrain forklift, put it in neutral and set the brakes. A rough terrain forklift operator shifts the forklift to neutral and sets the brake. Is he ready to start the forklift? Always look in the direction you are traveling. Be aware of obstructions to your view. Travel with the load trailing, or use a spotter if you are unable to see your travel path. Slow down and sound the horn at intersections and locations where your vision is obstructed. Make sure you have adequate clearance for rear tail swing and front fork swing. Stay inside the operator's compartment to protect your arms, legs, hands, and feet from being pinned and crushed by moving parts and objects outside of the rough terrain forklift. Do not allow anyone to stand on or pass under elevated portions of the rough terrain forklift. Remember that the cab's overhead structure does not guarantee your safety should it be hit by heavy loads dropped from a distance. You are operating a rough terrain forklift and need to cross a path that people and equipment frequently use on your site. What should you do? Maintain rough terrain lift stability to prevent tip-overs. Moving over unstable surfaces and rolling over rocks or potholes can cause tip-overs. Rough terrain forklifts are particularly susceptible to tip-overs when the load or boom is raised and when they are operating near capacity. When you ascend or descend a grade with a loaded rough terrain forklift, travel with the load upgrade. When you have no load, keep the load engaging means downgrade. In either case, avoid turning across slopes. It's important that you refer to the rough terrain forklift's manufacturer manual to determine maximum allowable grades for traveling, lifting, and parking. Keep loads low and tilted back just enough to clear ground obstructions. Downshift to a lower gear, engage the four-wheel drive, and proceed slowly with the load as low as possible. Which rough terrain forklift is descending a grade safely? Rough terrain forklifts can lose stability during cornering, braking, lifting, tilting, and lowering loads, especially when moving fast or abruptly. Make starts, stops, and turns in a smooth, slow manner to prevent loads from shifting. Turn gradually and widely, and remember not to turn on sloped surfaces. Avoid abrupt braking. Keep in mind that forklifts are especially susceptible to tip-overs when moving forward with the load raised. Lower the load before traveling. Under and overinflation increase the risk that rough terrain forklift tires will fail and cause tip-overs. To prevent this, maintain the tire air pressure that is recommended by the manufacturer in the forklift's manual. If the rough terrain forklift begins to tip, brace yourself and lean away from the impact to stay in the cab. Failing to buckle your seatbelt or attempting to jump free of the rough terrain forklift can result in fatal crushing injuries. Which rough terrain forklift is more at risk for tipping over? Operators are responsible for reviewing the manuals for their rough terrain forklifts. Follow the instructions and limitations listed there and on the load capacity chart and data plate. Make sure loads are within the rough terrain forklift's capabilities before attempting a lift. Before lifting, stop the rough terrain forklift on a stable surface. Set the parking brake and shift the transmission into neutral. Then, you must level the forklift before lifting the load. Rough terrain forklifts equipped with outriggers are more stable and can lift heavier loads when the outriggers are deployed. Many forklifts have leveling functions that allow you to compensate for slightly uneven terrain. Lifting without leveling leads to tip-overs. Making leveling adjustments with the load raised creates a dynamic force that can cause tipping. That's why you should not make leveling adjustments with the load raised. While lifting, watch closely for changes in the footing or other conditions that could cause the rough terrain forklift to shift out of level. After the load is in the air, if you discover that the rough terrain forklift is no longer level, bring the load back down before re-leveling the forklift. Before you lift a load with a rough terrain forklift, you should stop on a stable surface, set the parking brake, and shift the transmission into what state. After you complete a lift with a rough terrain forklift, retract the boom and lower it to the carry position. Then, move the forklift to a flat parking location that will not block fire aisles, stairways, or safety equipment. Place the directional controls in neutral. Apply the parking brake, and position the forks or other attachments flat on the ground. Turn off the engine and remove the key to prevent unauthorized operation. After you park and before you turn off the engine, where should you place the rough terrain forklift's forks or attachments? You should now be able to know how and when to start rough terrain forklifts. Recall safe practices to avoid collisions when operating rough terrain forklifts. Recall safe practices to prevent tip-overs when operating rough terrain forklifts. Recall safe practices for performing lifts with rough terrain forklifts, and know how to safely park rough terrain forklifts.